But let's look. Will the U.S. and you know what? Fuck it. Let's watch the other one first. You know, we're already talking about Ukraine, so might as well.
The annexation of Ukraine is inevitable.
So this is from Monsieur C, which is someone that I have disagreed with in the past, and he seems to have a little bit more conservative views than mine. However, you know, he makes interesting videos, so
Ukraine stands at a point of crucial importance for Russia
Why
on one
not?
side and all those who would seek
Why
to
the
detain
fuck
or
not?
challenge Russia on the other. For as long as Russia has existed with rivals to its west, it has sought to place distance between said rivals and its crucial heartlands. These heartlands are contained entirely within the European plain, a flat land which the West could theoretically funnel into full force with few natural barriers to stop them. The fall of the Soviet Union fractured Russia's historic imperial domain and has left it in its most geographically vulnerable state in centuries, still possessing a massive domain to oversee and protect with a relatively low population for its size and facing potential enemies across every border. Post-collapse, Russia sought rapprochement with the West now that the ideological divide was seemingly torn down, but Russia questioned and felt threatened by Western expansion into their former domain, as well as by the continuing coldness that lingered in Russia-Western.
Which, I mean, that argument is so dumb. I think he's not agreeing with this argument, but why is Russia afraid of NATO? What the fuck's NATO gonna do, bro? NATO is never gonna invade Russia, so what are they afraid of? The thing Russia wants, they want to be able to either invade or place puppet governments in places like Belarus, in places like Ukraine, in places like Moldova. That's what they want. They want influence, which, you know, I think it's fucking annoying. When are you going to react to the 1992 Atlantic hurricane season? We're going to do the Ukraine one, which is this one. We're going to do the Taiwan. And after that one, I promise I still keep it in mind. I'm not forgetting about it. But yeah, dude, I just think it's fucking stupid, you know?
Relations. Thus, it is, of course, its westernmost lands, its heartlands, which it is most concerned with protecting from what it recognizes as the encroaching West. Following the fall of the Soviet Union, Russia managed to maintain a hold over some of its breakaway states through economic, military, and political arrangements. But perhaps most important of all was Belarus, whose location allowed it to act as a buffer between Russia and much of the European Union.
It's similar to the Monroe Doctrine, I guess so. But Russia is not America, you know? Like, America can enforce any claim they want. Russia is a weak former empire, which the people are poor. It's a militaristic state. It's a surveillance state. It's very authoritarian, right? One of the most dangerous places to be a journalist. Like, I don't think Russia and America are even comparable.
To regain Ukraine, or at least strategic parts of it, would further reinforce Russia's western defense and allow it to shift its focus elsewhere, some believing that shift to be eastward toward challenging China and Iran for dominance in Asia, while others fear Russia's focus would turn toward the EU member states along the Baltic, threatening a direct war between Russia and Western Europe, in which Russia would then be in a more advantageous and secure position. Ukraine, however, instead of pursuing closer relations with Russia, has focused on Western alliance prospects instead. Russia, despite early hesitations, has since expressed its willingness to accept Ukrainian integration with the European Union, considering it the only natural direction for the country if it has in fact determined not to align with Russia.
Okay, yeah.
The EU is an economic rival but also a partner on the continent, and compromises have been achieved between the two powers before. Where Russia draws the line, however, is Ukraine's desire to join NATO, something which would place Western military assets within Ukraine and thus uncomfortably close to Russia's border. But first, let's take a moment to thank today's sponsor, Brilliant. Here on this channel, while I remember teachers who didn't Brilliant abilities master goes to remind me start Jorvin's disappear, go on, give it a back to the video into NATO, or Russia may not be willing.
They feel really insecure about their position since they want to be seen as equals to the US. Exactly, I agree, you know. They also a lot of territory, maybe more than they should have during USSR's collapse. True, Russia is way bigger than it should be, you know. From the British people I've talked to, many say if Russia did invade, why should we fight? I think most people in the West are tired of war. I think that's true. But at the same time, you know, no, it's true. People are tired of war. And I think World War II left a very scary scar when it comes to war. However, you just can't let Russia do whatever they want, you know. Talking about the British people, and it's very interesting, and I don't want to make a full-on comparison, but this is similar to appeasement and World War II style appeasement. You know, Hitler already invaded Crimea, okay, and nobody did anything about it. Maybe some sanctions and whatnot, but nobody did anything about Crimea. Not Putin was messing up with Kazakhstan a few weeks ago. Nobody did anything, right? We just can't let. At some point, we have to be like, yo, there's this line, you can't cross it, and if you cross it, shit's gonna go down. As an American, I'm more concerned with the southern Mexico border with a lot of illegals than Russia and Ukraine. Well, that's quite a statement.
Willing to let all of Ukraine go either, whether in
And that's true. You know, you guys, Mexico is not NATO, so you know, I'm not involved in it. But you guys, as Americans and British, I get you guys are more concerned with other things, but you do realize that Russia is gonna keep poking the bear until something happens. You gotta admit that Putin is desperate, and when someone is desperate, they can throw everything at the wall and be like, you know, whatever. Their territory is smaller than the Soviet Union's day, but ironically, their borders are the longest. So, yeah.
To NATO or the EU. South and eastern portions of Ukraine, including Crimea, are home to a population of some 6 million Russians, and while this population does constitute a large percentage of the overall population in each of their respective regions, in none of them but Crimea do they constitute an absolute majority. That being said, this Russian population in the south and east of Ukraine is extremely politically active, and unlike northwestern portions of Ukraine, are attempting to pull the country toward closer relations with Russia. The Russians regard these southeastern lands as historically theirs, and in reality they do share history. What we'd call Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine today first coming into existence as the loose union of the Kievan Rus in the late 9th century. Even then it was a rivalrous and internally divided state, and this ultimately led its land to be dominated by the
Belarus has been historic. Oh shit! Oh fuck!
Successfully reunite many of the Rus states under its leadership.
I was I assumed sorry about that, guys. Fucking hell.
This Russian population in the south and east of Ukraine is extremely politically active, and unlike northwestern portions of Ukraine, are attempting to pull the country toward closer relations with Russia. The Russians regard these southeastern lands as historically theirs, and in reality they do share history. What we'd call Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine today first coming into existence as the loose union of the Kievan Rus in the late 9th century. Even then it was a rivalrous and internally...
Which, if you think about it, you know, with that, you know, I'm just like the America state is in right now, and Joe Biden and COVID and all that. Americans don't care what's happening in Europe. That's exactly what happened in World War I and World War II. America wasn't concerned about what was going on in Europe. And I think we found multiple times that appeasement and appeasing a tyrant like Vladimir Putin isn't the way. You know, I'm trying to sound like an ass when I say illegals, but I'm talking about the ones from Central America crossing the borders illegally. Yeah, I can understand that. I'd be genuinely worried about the Ukraine situation if dumb people are in control, which the Cuban crisis had with JFK. Hindsight is 2020 though, so we
divided state, and
it's
this
just
ultimately led its land to be dominated by the invading Mongols.
I don't think, by the way, of course, I don't think we're gonna get into like World War III, and I don't think nukes are gonna be involved. But I think this is there's a lot of tension, and people should care about this, especially when you live in Europe.
But the Rus Principality of Muscovy would rise up and successfully reunite many of the
I can at least vouch against the British PM going over that in that regard.
The lands of the Ukraine were not yet among the lands reunited by Russia, however, and they instead found themselves under the control of Poland, Lithuania in the northwest and the Turks to the south. So would they remain for roughly 3 centuries before the Ukrainian population rebelled against Polish-Lithuanian rule to unite with Russia instead, with whom they felt more familiar. In the eyes of Ukraine, they had brought themselves under the protection of an essential relative, while for Russia, they felt as though they had finally brought these
America entered World War II because of Pearl Harbor. Yeah, of course, but at the end of the day, they were involved.
Efforts at Russification were taken up in Ukraine to reintegrate the state and do away with any foreign influences that might have...
Like, you know, they were sending weapons to the Allies anyways, so they were involved in the war before necessarily joining. Plus...
taken root since
well, no, that's it.
This Russification proved successful in some regions, though in others only fueled Ukrainian resentment toward Russia and emphasized a sense of uniqueness to the Ukrainian identity as something wholly different from that of Russia. This resentment was only intensified by World War I, the Russian Civil War, the Great Famine, World War II, and the subsequent decades of Russo-communist rule until the USSR's ultimate
Yeah,
collapse.
Ukraine has been through a lot.
Attempts were made at rapprochement between Russia and the Ukraine. However, greater Ukrainian desires for integration with the West made clear that Russia could not depend upon the state's long-term cooperation in the pursuit of mutual security, and as relations between the two broke down, Russia opted to resolve its relationship and dependency upon Ukraine through alternative means. In the 2010s, upon Ukraine's pro-Russia government refusing to sign the European Union-Ukraine Association Agreement, protests broke out which escalated to the point of revolution, which ousted the sitting president in favor of a more pro-Western replacement.
Fucking horrible.
In response, pro-Russian protests erupted across the south and east. Russia seized upon this opportunity to invade and annex Crimea, and lend support to other pro-Russian separatist regions in the east. Now confident of Ukraine's future as a part of the West, Russia is left with few options to both secure its border and bring what it considers historic and ethnically Russian lands back under its control. Thus, military force is now on the table. In a direct conflict between Russia and Ukraine, there is no question that Russia would emerge victorious. Russia boasts superior capabilities across every metric. On land, sea, or air, in population, in resources, and technology, Ukraine simply does not stand a chance. Certainly, Ukraine has been bolstering their defenses in recent years.
Yeah, I agree. I think they really fear America.
But still, this does not even come close to leveling the playing field. The most often used arguments in defense of Ukraine's ability to fend off Russian conquest are twofold. Firstly are Ukraine's allies. It's assumed that should Russia initiate a direct invasion
America
of Ukraine,
and the European Union. Real hot take here. Oh no. I feel Crimea shouldn't keep being shown as Ukrainian. It's like showing the CPP with Taiwan. It's not a politically correct to represent who holds what territory. True. I mean, it's true. Russia controls Crimea, so, it is what it is. However, it happened so recently, 2014, and the annexation is not recognized, I think, I don't know, but by a lot of countries. So you're right, but at the same time, it is a hot take. You're right with that. It is a hot take.
Unfortunately for Ukraine, this does not appear to be the case. The United States, fresh off the disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan and the failure of that 2-decade-long conflict, is the most hesitant it has been in decades to involve itself in a foreign conflict. Moreover, this would be a war that directly...
And that's the thing, right? People don't care about what's going on in Ukraine. And I've heard a lot of people are like, well, going to war for Ukraine is not worth it. And you're right, it's not worth it. But at the same time, where are we going to draw the line?
Hits the United States up.
Are we going to let Putin just bully us into submission? We're going to let Putin literally bully us into getting what he wants. There has to be a line drawn somewhere. And Ukraine is an independent nation. If they want to join NATO, they can do it. They're independent. Russia shouldn't have given Crimea to Ukraine back then. We could have avoided it. True,
Not some secondary world power, but a European great power. Something the US has not done since World War II. Now, Biden said back in December, quote, "The idea the United States is going to unilaterally use force to confront Russia invading Ukraine is not in the cards right now, but there will be severe consequences. Those consequences appear to be purely economic and political, with the most radical action proposed being to lock Russia out of various international organizations. This does not appear to intimidate the Russians, who have long expressed dissatisfaction with these Western-led global institutions, to the point of proposing the establishment of...
Yeah, there's a few things that could be done financially. For example, leaving Russia outside international banking. That was an option talked about. Europe consumes a lot of Russian gas. So they could put tariffs, or they can consume gas from somewhere else, right? America was talking about subsidizing gas to the EU, so they don't need Russian gas. There's a lot of measures that could really, really starve Russia. But if Russia did take over most of Ukraine, they would probably have a hard time holding it. I agree with that, since it's a land full of anti-Russian, heavily armed populations. I hate how what countries recognize is seen as the only metric border for change. That's true. We have plenty border changes in 2011, but not
of their
recognized
own
by most
alternatives with
governments.
various Eastern partners.
Also, international
As of late
organizations
January,
like the
people are
UN.
pointing to what has been perceived as a pivot by the United States from economic and political deterrence to proposals for increasing American military presence in Eastern Europe as a sign that direct American intervention is not off the table. But the reality of this would almost certainly be nothing more than a defensive tactic should the Russo-Ukrainian conflict spill over into the NATO states of Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, Romania, and the Baltics, and only in such a circumstance would war between Russia and the West break out. The Russians are very aware of this and likely will not make any provocations outside Ukraine to threaten an actual Western intervention.
Yeah.
Truly, the only way by which Ukraine could derive direct military assistance from the West would be through alliances with individual states, say Poland or Romania. However, these states have very much to lose from such action, and again risk the outbreak of a much larger war through NATO, or no longer being guaranteed the security of NATO because they willingly made themselves a belligerent. As far as Western Europe goes, there is great hesitance to trigger a war with Russia, as such a war would see Europe heavily dependent upon American military involvement. As we've gone over before, American contributions to NATO have allowed Western Europe to dial back their own military spending, resting secure that the US will provide adequate support. However, that's no longer proving sufficient for this modern age, and the EU has thusly begun working toward establishing a united
Yeah.
army.
Europe is gonna be needing to spend some more cash on that army. I was looking for a map on Crimea's recognition. I just found out on the subreddit of our Ukraine. It's doing a prediction tournament for which month Russia might invade. Yo, that's awesome, bro. Let's try to look on that. Ukraine. There we go. Is this the one? This is probably not the one, but gosh, it'd be so fucking funny to see it. Oh no. This is the one.
Of its own, but until that day comes, large-scale European military action against Russia is highly unlikely. Now,
Caspian Report just released a video on what a Russian invasion might look like. At the top there, it's predictions live. Oh shit. Oh, there we go. Oh shit. I wonder what's the winner. Should we vote? There's 3.4 thousand players in one prediction. Let's see. Oh, I can't vote. I think I have to log in. When will Russia invade Ukraine again on a larger scale? I think they're gonna do it like maybe March, April. Of course, I think right now it's winter, right? So conditions must be pretty rough. But God, I don't know if you guys can see. There we go. There it is. My option will not invade. I think it's gonna invade. I think it's pretty likely that they are gonna invade between March and April. That's my prediction. April. If I had to vote, I would go for April.
secondly, it's argued that if Russia were to conquer all or part of Ukraine, an insurgency would emerge and force Russia to withdraw. Russia sees Ukraine as a long-term investment. On a long enough timeline, Europe will develop an army, Ukraine will join the EU and NATO, and whether or not the United States are involved at all, a war between Europe and Russia may break out. When that day comes, Russia wants its defenses to stand as secure as possible, and that cannot be achieved with Ukraine Russia won't involved at all. A war between Europe and Russia may break out.
But why? Why would a war between Europe and Russia break out? It just doesn't make any fucking sense. Like, Europe buys a shit ton of oil and particularly gas from Russia, right? They both benefit from their relationship. Russia culturally is pretty much European. I just don't understand why would Russia think, or why would Russia go for war against Europe? It just doesn't make any fucking sense. Economically, politically, socially, it doesn't make any fucking sense. Why would Russia get into a war with Europe? If anything, they should be closer to Europe. It's just, post-Cold War bullshit. Russia being a little scared dog, trying to attack anything that gets close to it. When Russia invades Ukraine, that's when China will finally take over Taiwan because all the focus. Yeah, that's true. That's what I'm scared of,
When
unfortunately.
that day comes, Russia wants its defenses to stand as secure as possible, and that cannot be achieved with Ukraine protruding into its heartland as it currently does. If Russia must fight an insurgency for a year, 5 years, or 10 years, it will do so to secure its border against a greater threat later down the line. It's
And the
what they've been
Russian
doing
economy
since the
will
fall of
keep
the Soviet
collapsing.
Union. Russia recognizes that this is the time to stabilize and correct any weakness in their border, especially now while the great powers are so hesitant to fight. If the stakes are high, Russia
That's
might
true.
settle for annexing only lands with a significant Russian population. Holding these lands as opposed to the whole of Ukraine would be relatively simple, as the risk of a large insurgency forming is relatively low. Annexing the whole of Ukraine, including disputed Transnistria, would be the most difficult, as Ukrainians would have nowhere to go, radicalizing the population and contributing to a massive insurgency movement that would take years to quell. Strategically, Russia's best bet would be to annex the entire eastern portion of the country with the Dnieper River as the western frontier, providing the Russian south with a significant natural barrier against invasion. Western Ukraine remains autonomous.
That
and is
do
able
make
to-
sense. I think this might be what we will end up looking at. There's no limit for the meat grinder. There's money to be made by military contractors and Mer Group, and the poor ain't gonna revolt. They don't care enough. Maybe, I don't know. I do feel that a lot of Ukrainians have very anti-Russian views, and imagine being bullied by Russia for centuries. I mean, you might not stand for it. It does make kind of sense. Russia is already under sanctions, and they invade the sanctions would be crippling. That's true. The cost of war is very elevated. The cost of an invasion is elevated, and the cost of keeping a puppet state, it's very elevated. So Russia's not going to be able to stand for long. It does make kind of sense because Europe goes to war like it's an Olympic hobby. Sometimes, particularly in the past. The US and the UK invaded Russia in 1918. So World War One. I didn't knew that. When UK was in the UN, Macron hated the British. God slut. Well, keeping the tradition alive of the Russian and the French and the British hating each other. Yeah, Russia might be scared of being influenced by the West, and yet they're very politically similar and actually Western allies like Poland and Hungary. It's true. I just don't get it. I don't get why the Russian government, because I don't think the people feel like this that much, are so scared of the West. Like, oh, NATO, is this some sort of ghost that's gonna? No, dude, no. You're just screwing yourself up.
pursue its European
That's a
ambitions,
reality.
while many in eastern Ukraine flee westward. Certainly an insurgency could still emerge, but unlike a total conquest scenario,
fucking
a conquest
stupid.
up to the Dnieper does not produce a massive disgruntled population with no choice but to fight.
And again, you
Most
gotta feel
common
bad
people
for
would
the
opt to pick up the
Ukrainians.
pieces of their life and move to the west, as would the government, eventually recognizing the east is not something worth warring over, though they might passively support a resistance movement until it was ultimately suppressed by Russia. Is the annexation of Ukraine inevitable? Perhaps not entirely, but it is very probable. Russia's motive and ability is simply too great for them not to act
I
on
agree.
this opportunity sooner rather than later, though that
I agree. They invaded Russia during the Civil War. Their imperialism is even Western-like. Russia and Europe have always been enemies, like England and Scots and Welshmen. True. It's just historical stuff, man, that I personally think it's just a bunch of bullshit, like I think Russia would benefit actually from closer relations with the West. Most Russians are actually against the Putin regime. They obviously can't say that because, yeah. True. Let's watch